I will share the presentation today with my colleagues from AgroSolutions. So there will be Gabrielle, Lorette, and Gaëtan that will be here. Gaëtan will be replacing Lorette, that is quitting AgroSolutions from the month of August. So the agenda for today: first, we'll have definition of payment for ecosystem services. So for this financing instrument, the concept is still a bit vague sometimes, with few concrete functioning examples in Europe. But Gabrielle will try to clarify that. And then we will provide some insight on the case study and real-world example that we realize. Share also some good practices and recommendations, and discuss applicability to the different use cases. At the end of the webinar, if we still have time, we could discuss the integration potential with other financial mechanisms, such as triple capital accounting and insurance mechanism. I planned a Q&A session at the end, but as I said, you can raise your hand during the presentation if you have questions or remarks. And so now I leave the floor to Gabrielle for the presentation. Oh no, I have just one more thing to tell you. Just as an introduction, I wanted to remind you the different tasks that we have on PES. So it's task 4.2, local tailoring payments for ecosystem services, with AgroSolutions as a leading partner. And so our work will focus first on developing a range of PES indicators for use cases to be able to measure and assess the biodiversity gap that we can have, or the ecosystem service gap that we can have between the initial state of the environment and the state after the practice change, and also define some local and adapted thresholds for the different indicators to measure environmental performance. And the second task will be more the design of a conceptual, flexible, adaptable PES framework that will help stakeholders to develop some PES scheme more easily, especially with legal and contracting expertise. So yes, Gabrielle, you can go for the definition of the concept of payment for service ecosystem.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Or no? Yes? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So first, we can start with a definition of ecosystem services that were defined globally in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2005. So this is the benefits people obtain from ecosystems. And this includes 4 types of services, which are provisioning services that will produce prime materials, such as food, water, timber, and fiber. The regulating services will affect the balance of the ecosystem, so climate and flood regulation, disease regulation, waste management, and water quality. The cultural services will provide landscape value and spiritual benefits. And finally, the supporting services that allow for the provision of the other type of services, and that will be soil formation, photosynthesis, or nutrient cycling. So this is the global definition that is commonly accepted today. We can go on the next slide. So first, before giving definition of payment for ecosystem services, we made a review of the gray literature on the topic. And what we could see at first is that there is a lot of French documentation on the subject, because in France, PS were mainly developed with the biodiversity plan in 2018. And so in that framework, pilot PS were implemented, and several guidelines and studies were produced on the topic. So we can base a lot on French sources. And at first, there is a small distinction that can be made between 2 terms that are ecosystem services and environmental services. So for the first one, ecosystem services refer to the benefits that are provided directly by the ecosystem. whereas the environmental services are the ones that are provided by humans, so here the farmers, to optimize the provision of the ecosystem services. So for example, it can be for land manager, the conservation of the forest that will provide hydrological services, which are provided directly by the ecosystem. So even if there's this small distinction, both terms are often used as synonyms for the definition of payment for ecosystem or environmental services. So now, among the sources that we gathered, we noted that there was a lot of different definitions that were given for PS. Some of them are more operational, some other are theoretical. And besides, a PS can take multiple forms. So here we give a definition that includes two scopes, a broad sense and a strict sense. And that was given by a French organization. And we chose this one because it tries to include the diversity of existing mechanisms. So the broad definition is that PS is a financial tool in which there is one provider of an environmental service that is not constrained and that is paid to implement or to conserve practices to maintain the identified environmental service. So this includes, for example, agro-environmental measures, which are from the Common Agricultural Policy, water agencies programs, and we can also discuss the place of carbon credits in this definition. And the strict sense would be the fact that it is a voluntary bilateral contract between the provider and the financer. So this means that both of the financer and the provider have a benefit, and that the financer is directly the beneficiary of the service. So this will include private contracts, but also environmental certification. For example, the PS of Vitel, which is a private water company, is paying farmers to implement some practices that will allow to provide the hydrological service in the catchment area. And if we take the financing angle, the PS typology can be in three categories, which are private schemes or PS that are financed by the user, public schemes or government financed PS, and schemes that are hybrids, so that combine public and private financing. So here to continue, so this is a classification of PS that was given by a French organization. That is one approach to classify PS in the economical instruments. So the first criteria to classify the instruments for ecosystem services is either it is financial or non-financial. For non-financial instruments, this includes regulations and mandatory standards. So this can be, for example, tree cutting prohibition or the regulation of hunt for some species. And then if we enter financial instruments, there can be two cases. The first one is that the supplier is constrained. So this will include all the polluter pays instruments, so environmental taxes, public subsidies, and mandatory compensations. Then when the supplier is voluntary, we enter the definition of PS, and we have two cases for the buyer, either voluntary and constrained. And then for each cases, there are two cases, either the contract is bilateral or collective. For the bilateral contract, this means that the financier is directly the beneficiary of the service. There is an advantage for the payer and for the provider. So when the buyer is voluntary, this will be private contracts, so the one that is on the top, and also environmental certification. And when the buyer is constrained, the bilateral contracts will be access rights to a certain resource that is open water. So, for example, in Mexico, there is forest landowners that are paid to conserve the forest cover. And in order to finance this, the water distributing companies that are the beneficiary of the hydrological services provided by the forest have to pay a mandatory contribution to finance this service. And the difference with the category that is just below is that the organization is collective. So the financement comes from collective resources and compulsory contribution. And the financer here is not directly the beneficiary, or not in all of the cases. So this can be, for example, taxes that are paid by consumers on some products that they buy and that are affected to payment for ecosystem services. In this category are also included agri-environmental measures from the CAP that are paid by the state budgets. And so here the buyer is constrained because the member states have to contribute to the Common Agricultural Policy budget. And finally, the second case of collective is that when the buyer is voluntary, so that can be voluntary contributions, and here the financiers are the donators to non-governmental organizations. And you can go on the next slide.
Yeah, maybe just an information regarding the beneficiary of the service. Usually for PS, the financier is also a direct beneficiary of the service provided, since the mechanism relies on the voluntary transaction between the financing party and the provider, the manager of the land or ecosystem. However, we can see that some funds or banks can act as financer also without being the direct ultimate beneficiary themselves. So, for instance, we have an example with the WWF France Nature Impact Fund that finance sustainable forest project through PES. And so funds are collecting from the engaged company, who are often indirect beneficiaries, and redistributed to ecosystem managers. So in this case, the fund acts as a financial pool where investor can aggregate their funding, and it channels it to the providers of the ecosystem services.
So to go further on the theoretical definition, so if we look at sources that are European or in other parts of the world, there is one definition that is given in general, which is the one of Wonder, and that defines PS with 5 criteria. So it says that it is a voluntary transaction with an identified ecosystem service that is bought by at least one buyer from at least one provider. And the last criteria is that the payment is made only if the ecosystem service provider secures the provision of the service. So in practice, the condition of the provision of the service is, in most of the cases, the practices that are expected to lead to the provision of the service. And along with it, there are 2 underlying principles that are not included in this definition, but that are often cited along. This is first additionality, which refers to the fact that the identified ecosystem service is provided only if there is a payment. So the mechanism has to allow to go beyond the reference scenario. This means, for example, increasing the PES provision with the payment, or reducing the degradation of the provision of the service, or in the last case, improving further the provision of the service. And secondly, the payment has to be incentive in order to motivate the provider to engage into the mechanism. And yes, so if we put together the principles that we saw just before, so there is a buyer that can be the beneficiary, but not in all of the cases, that pays the provider. And between the two of them, we have an intermediary that can ensure the support of the payment, of the mechanism. So this is control support, technical support, This can be organization and facilitation management. So this intermediary is often a local authority or actor that is implemented on the territory. So for example, a university, a consulting company, or a monitoring, reporting, and verification company. So the provider here, that is the farmer or forest lands owner, engages voluntarily into the implementation of practices. So it has the liberty to implement the practices or not. And then these practices are expected to lead to the provision or to the support of identified ecosystem services. That is the conditionality that is linked either to the implementation of practices or directly to the identified ecosystem service provided. And then this service offers benefits that are gained for the beneficiary or for the buyer when it is the same. So yeah, we can go on the next. And finally, if we take a look at the composition of the payment, so the payment can be first result-based or output-based. So this means it is linked directly to the desired state of the ecosystem service, and the payment is unblocked only if this state is reached. And on the case of action-based or input-based payment, this time it is made for specific action that is assumed to lead to the provision of the service. So when the service is easy to quantify, so for example, the ton of carbon that is sequestrated, the payment can be based on the result. But when the service is difficult to quantify or to measure, so as it is the case often for biodiversity, the payment is often based on the actions implemented. So in the case of action-based payment, in general, the payment is based on the cost of opportunity, which is the loss of income plus the management costs. For example, if the action is the plantation of hedgerows, the cost of opportunity will cover the loss of agricultural surface that is due to the implementation of hedges and the costs of planting and managing hedges. On the diagram below, so we have an example of a forest that is converted into agricultural land. So in this case, the benefits for the ecosystem managers are bigger than when it is a forest, but there are costs for the local population, for the society, which are the services that are no longer provided by the forest. So in order to incentivize the forest owner to conserve the forest, the minimum payment has to cover at least the difference in benefits between agricultural land and forest conservation. At this payment is added the incentive payments, so to increase the participation of the land manager into the scheme. So the payment has to compensate at least the loss of income, but on the other hand, it must not exceed the social value of the service that are provided in order to pay the landowner only for the services that the forest is providing and not for more. So these are the bases we can take in order to build the payment of the PS scheme. And yes, this is all for this part. Yeah.
Thank you, Gabrielle. So we'll go to the case study now, and we'll one example. And yes, it's still you for the presentation.
Yes. So in order to go to real-world examples, we conducted a case study on 20 PS schemes that were part of France, out of France in Europe, and out of Europe. So here we selected some schemes that would target equally between them either a group of watersheds, a natural reserve or natural park, a region, or an entire country. So here the aim was to look at the different composition of the PS mechanism and to see what we could have as conclusions. So the average number of environmental aspects that were covered by PS, it is not only one, it can be two. So this is two or more. So here we have two in average. The environmental targets, so they are carbon, water, biodiversity, or landscape values. If we take a look at the financiers, there are at minimum three, so it's in average, sorry, three in average. So the financier type is in most of the cases mixed public-private here, but it can also be a private company, a water agency, or the ministry government. And in 65% of the cases, the financier was the initiator of the program. And so in the cases of the financier is not the initiator, this can be, for example, a cooperative that builds the program and that monitors it, but the financiers would be the food industries that are supplying into the cooperative. So now regarding the intermediary, there is an intermediary in half of the cases, and in these cases, it is kind of equally either a non-governmental organization or an organization that is attached to the government, or it can be also a specialized company. And these intermediaries will provide the control and technical support for the scheme. And finally, regarding the monitoring and whether the payment is output or input based, in most of the cases, it is input based. So this shows that maybe it is more difficult to base the payments on outputs, on results. And there is also two schemes that are a combination of both input-based or output-based payments. And regarding the indicators, in the majority of the cases, it was a combination of quantitative and qualitative indicators.
Yeah, maybe just an additional information regarding the PS case study. It was on purpose that we tried to mix the different ecosystems, different countries and geographical scale, and also different types of financer. So it's normal that we have a lot of diversity. This is what we were seeking. In reality, we have a lot more public funding in PS and also a concentration of PS in France, for instance, in Europe. So this is not representative of the total PS scheme that we can find, but this is a selected portion that were on purpose very diversified.
Yes, so we wanted to focus on some real case example that we analyzed that we think it's interesting for you to have a good overview of what's possible. So what we can see is that even given different ecosystems that we have, so arable, grassland, forest, or highlands, most of the time the objective of the PES is related to water preservation or water quality. So we have different kind of financing, whether it is public-private, only public or only private, but the main focus, I would say, of the PES we analyzed was a lot related to water quality and conservation. So if we look at the first one, it's based in France on arable land, and it's more of a supply chain initiative. So it was initiated by a NGO in partnership with agri-foods industries and the water agency. So we have contractualization for 5 years with the farmers that are the providers, and they try to upscale regenerative agriculture. So we can see that the price is based on a payment per hectare and per year. So it can vary from 30 euros to almost 80 euros. And it's based on the regeneration index, based on 11 practices that the farmers can implement. Then the other one that we thought would be interesting to see, it's on grassland, also in France, and also financed by the water agency with a 5 years contractualization. This one is seek to preserve permanent grasslands. So we can question here the concept of additionality, because the farmers are paid to just maintain their practices. There is no aim to make them change or have better practices. The objective is really to maintain the permanent grasslands in the area. And it's also based on practice indicators. The price can vary a lot. So, but most of the time, like the average is 130 euros per hectare and per year. Another interesting PS that we wanted to show you is the Copenhagen Energy Fund. So it's also based on water quality and quantity preservation. And this one is based on water tax paid directly by the consumers that is pulled into a fund. So it's only 10 euros per year and per person, which lead to an average of payment for the foresters and farmers up to 526 euros per hectare and per year. And what's also interesting in this case is that sometimes it's the government that purchase farmland in order to reforest the area. So it's quite extreme as a mechanism, but it's also interesting to see. And the last one, it's in the UK, and it's more based on highlands, also for water quality and quantity preservation. And it's more public initiated initiative, but it makes public with private financing, also with water tax paid by the consumers. So with that, I think we can have a good overview of what's available out there in the real world.
Yes. So yes, if we have conclusion on the case study analysis, so there are often multiple financing sources. It is not only one single source. In most of the cases, the payment relies on action-based, so on actions. So it's because biodiversity conservation is often difficult as a service to isolate and to quantify, and also the cost of on-field measurement is high. Also, so the number of environmental targets per mechanism is not only one, it is an average 2. And it also allows to concentrate the efforts on some specific targets. And another point is that the main contract duration is between 3 or 5 years. So this is not very long. It allows for testing, but also for the possibility of renewal. So this case study is still a work in progress, and it allows to give at first some insights on the operational challenges and practices that will be to address in the framework. Yes.
And finally, in this part, we wanted to discuss the similarities and differences also with biodiversity certificates, because there is another WP5 working on this aspect, and sometimes there is some confusion. If we take a very broad definition of payment for ecosystem services, it can almost integrate biodiversity certificates. So just to clarify a few points, at least on our point of view, in terms of definition, so payment for ecosystem services is really conditional payments made to landowner to maintain or enhance specific ecosystem services. So it's a market between the service providers and the buyers, where the compliance certificates or voluntary certificates are more biodiversity units that are usually tradable also. So the beneficiaries in the case of PES, it works with direct contractualization providers, and the payments may be ongoing or periodic, often contractual for continued ecosystem service delivery. When for compliance certificates, usually you have standardized certificates or credit, so tradable on dedicated markets. It's also the case for voluntary certificates that are used to demonstrate some commitments with some variability in the standards that are used. And the credits are generated and sold based on demonstrated positive biodiversity outcomes after monitoring and verifications. In terms of payment conditionality, very strong payment conditionality in the case of PES, as Gabrielle presented, often negotiated during the contractualization. There is usually also strong legal requirement for result in the case of offset with validation by third independent party. And in the case of voluntary certificates, it might be more viable depending on the standard we use. In terms of scope and flexibility, maybe the PES is a bit more focused on a specific service, but it can be very adaptable and flexible. So innovation is possible depending on the context. When compliance credits are a bit less flexible, focused on mandatory regulation and compliance, sometimes a bit bureaucratic, sorry. And when also voluntary certificates can be a little more flexible and encourage innovation between with public and private partnership, but also biodiversity carbon finance integration. Yes, I will stop here. This is some things we wanted to discuss with you, and that we will also discuss with Don more specifically, because he had also his opinion on the complementarity between the two mechanisms. Okay, so now let's discuss challenges, good practices, and recommendations. So this is really a first idea because we are still working on this part, but we wanted to provide you today with some challenges and good practices that we imagine and we found in the grey literature especially. So regarding the governance, one of the challenges that we can mention is the limited participation of the landowners to the program. Also, there is sometimes complementarity or competition with existing public financing scheme, and so there is a doubt that arises regarding the fact that we can pay double for ecosystem services, and we need to clarify what is already paid by public financing, what could be additional in this situation by the PES financing. This is some cases that we encounter in France, for instance. And there is also a difficulty to integrate PES into broader context, especially to include external biophysical stresses. So for instance, forest fires, pollution, climate change, that can also impact the ecosystem stability. One of the good practices that we can provide for the moment is to rely on local entities, cooperative local authorities for technical support and coordination, and they can also allow to better the engagement and the participation of landowners, especially farmers with farmers cooperative. Regarding the contracting, one of the challenges is that we often have multiple intermediaries, so it can be a bit difficult to manage, and also some administrative complexity regarding contractual arrangements can be a bit bureaucratic and complex, hindering the efficiency and implementation in some contexts of the PES schemes. For the good practices, what we see is that we need a simple, clear, and adaptable contractual framework. So this is something also we will try to provide in the WP4 task 4.2. There will be a need also for flexibility in the face of ecological and climatic uncertainties. So how to adapt the contractual clauses if there is some external stresses like forest fires or climate change, once again. Maybe one good practices would also be to target 1 or 2 environmental services to concentrate the effort and the improvement of practices, and to prefer mid or long-term contracts to avoid reversibility of the practices. In terms of financing, the challenges are more about the difficulties to mobilize stable and sufficient financing, especially for the long-term projects. Difficulties also to mobilize private funding. So local private actors do not always perceive the immediate economic benefit from the payment. And also one of the barriers for financing is the limited evidence of the actual effectiveness of the scheme, which can hinder continuous financing and financial actors' engagement. So good practices for this criteria could be public-private financing synergies that can help also to alleviate the financial burden of the monitoring cost. Clarify also the business case for private PES. So speak more of value chain, long-term resilience, environmental claim that can be made from PES. The use of remote sensing also for monitoring that can help reduce the monitoring cost and so the transaction costs. And maybe be based on existing labels as criteria for payment to simplify. And last part is the monitoring. So here, the challenges we see is the high requirements for evidence and traceability. So this is something we see also for all the kind of payments for environmental services. That is also for carbon credits, for instance, very high cost for monitoring. That requires reliable indicators, sometimes independent validation, verification, and that pose technical and financing challenges. And one other point for PES is to define adapted indicators to assess the provision of the ecosystem services. And as was saying Gabrielle, some biodiversity-related services are quite difficult to quantify precisely, or it is very costly. So it complicates the definition of the contractual objective of the PES scheme. Good practices in this situation could be to define good thresholds that the indicators have to reach to unlock the payment. Combine also indicators of mean and results, and increase the use of digital technologies like satellites or sensors that can improve monitoring, but it requires appropriate skills and resources. So these good practices will be complemented by our work and also the discussion we will have with you. And I think a good part of the challenges will be also tackled by the BioCapital project. Next part is regarding applicability to use cases, and I will leave the floor to Gaëtan for this part.
Thank you, Romane. So here we just wanted to present you the different use cases defined by the working group number 2. So this is based on the use case manager description and completed with the WP2 questionnaires to refine each use case. These findings will be completed after sending our questions. So we will build a questionnaire, WP4 questionnaire, just to clarify some points about this use case. But we thought it was interesting for you just to recall the 5 use cases we have. So the first one is about alpine forests based on the Austria and Italy context. So the provider targeted our forest owners in order to implement closer to nature sustainable forest management practices. So it's typically logging techniques, mixed species forests, or deadwood management. Providing regulation services such as hydrological services, erosion reduction, or water quality, for example. The use case number 2 is based on the French context, and it is about agricultural lands. So here we target farmers and rural landowners to implement agroforestry practices and soil conservation practices, such as crop diversification, no-till farming, or multi-species cover crops. And we focus on regulation services and supporting services more broadly, such as enhancing biodiversity. The use case number 3 is based on the Romanian context and is also about agricultural lands. But so it is close to the use case number 2, but here we focus on agroforestry practices. So it is mentioned both in-field agroforestry, when we have alignment of trees inside the plots, the agricultural plots, and hedgerows, so on the edge of the plots. And it is focusing also on the organic farming practices, conversion and maintenance. The ecosystem services targeted are quite the same, but more specifically on droughts and floods regulation also. The use case number 4 is based on the Slovenian context and the species-rich grasslands. Here, small family-run farms are targeted, so very small farms compared to the French context, for example. And the practices targeted are about preservation and restoration of grassland practices, so it's quite general. It will have to be precised later. And the supporting services targeted are about preservation and restoration, so yeah, quite general. The last use case number 5, is based on the UK context and deals with river corridors and wetlands buffers. And the practices targeted here are about effective wetland buffers and riparian management strategies. Maybe one point of differentiation is about cultural services. Here, it is also something we want to study. If you go to the next slide. So I will not go in too much detail, but the idea is just to say that the regulatory context in this use case 1, we have a good policy framework, especially in Austria. In Italy, the framework is maybe less structured and supports less the private initiatives. So as a result, we have the financial stakeholders are mostly public funders, like associations of local authorities or the European funds, such as the Life funds, FEDER or Interreg. And as a barrier, we identified no guarantee for the provider of a long-term commitment. So the investment are usually made on an annual basis, and the financial barriers is also something we noticed, as the amount paid is well under estimated compared to the substantial savings allowed by the ecosystem services. As a recommendation, maybe it would be interesting to provide tailored compensation solution and to reduce transaction costs and prioritize high environmental services value, just to be sure the PES is focused on the areas where it is the most efficient. On the use case number 2, the regulatory context, for the regulatory context, France is quite structured on this part. As Gabrielle said, we had a biodiversity plan in 2018, which started an experimentation on PES, and we have now in 2025 a new regulation promoting PES. So we expect this to promote the development of PES, but mostly most of the financial stakeholders are still public funders. So the idea would be to target also the private funds. So we have some examples here in France, but it's still pilot projects or initiatives, but it's developing. In the limits, we have, I won't go in that detail. You will have the presentation later, but maybe that's interesting to say about the long-term commitments. Usually it's short-term commitments we observe. So the providers are maybe overcautious without this long-term strategy. And there are some difficulties in measuring the actual benefits of each ecosystem services. So it's linked with the MRV solutions that we need to precise. And maybe one more point about the administrative constraints. One recommendation would be to harmonize and simplify all the procedures, which is maybe the first barrier for farmers to implement PES. On the use case number 3, we noticed a few national or local schemes. So here the regulatory context rely mostly on the CAP, and as a result we have mostly public funders or exclusively public funders, and we can see quite the same limits as the previous cases, such as administrative barriers, social cultural barriers also. So in the adoption of the practices by the farmer. So it's linked with the traditional way all the traditional practices of the farmer. Financial and logistical barriers also, and a few MRV solutions. So this is a recurrent barrier. As a recommendation, maybe the adaptation of schemes to the local specificities is a priority. In the Romanian agricultural landscape, we have very different cases for the farms, like big farms and small farms. So in each context, we would have to adapt schemes in enabling to embark every kind of farms. In the use case number 5, sorry. So here we have a well-developed regulatory framework for the UK, supporting indirectly PES. So here it's not regulation specifically about PES, but it is about implementing sustainable farming practices. And we observe that most of the funders are public funders. And we can, one recommendation would be to focus more on private funders, and that could be insurance companies or natural capital investors, for example. About the limits, it's kind of the same limits identified. So institutional barriers, administrative barriers, the need of simplification, financial barriers with the lack of dedicated funding and adequate financial incentives. The MRV barriers, it's also applicable for the UK context, and social cultural barriers. So here the first recommendations would be to strengthen integrate governance at the watershed scale, because for the water issues more specifically, the governance would be a bit different, as it involves a lot of different stakeholders. So the governance is a key point here to address, and ensure long-term stable financing for PS. As I said previously, this is a key point also, as we want the farmers to implement actions in a long-term schedule. So yeah, use case number 4 about Slovenia. So here the legislation is also robust. We saw that it is supporting conservation of species-rich grasslands, and it's integrating the EU directives. But at the same time, it's mostly public funders also. So as a general conclusion, we can see that the private sector is less represented. It's always the public funders that are financing the PES today. And for the limits and recommendation, it's quite the same, so I won't go in these details. And I think that's all. So these are just first conclusions, and we'll discuss more with the use case managers.
Yeah, we'll be happy to discuss it more regarding ecosystem services that we target. Also, if you have some ideas regarding interesting indicators, the regulatory or private voluntary context, and the limits you identified, we will ask some of these questions in a WP4 questionnaire that we will send together with other WP4 partners at the end of July. So for the use case manager, so then we can that we can have a better understanding also of how we can develop PS in the different use cases. So thank you, Gaëtan. And the last part is regarding the integration potential with other financial instruments. So I'm not a specialist, so this is first ideas. I will be happy also to discuss it with some experts that we have here today. So first, regarding triple capital accounting. So what we think is that triple capital accounting can provide a conceptual and methodological framework to value the financial flows that are linked to ecosystem services. And also, PES schemes can constitute, from a triple capital accounting perspective, a source of investment to enhance or replenish the natural capital of the company. So, for instance, in a proactive way, if a company engaged in triple capital accounting, they might record the amounts that are paid or received through the PES schemes as financial flows that strengthen its natural capital in an expanded balance sheet. So this is the first situation. Second situation could be when a company see that its natural capital is degraded. The loss can be reflected in the accounting, so in the triple capital accounting, as a decrease in environmental value and deficit of natural capital. So PES can then function as a financial mechanism that aimed at rebuilding or compensating for this degradation by directly paying the actors who protect, restore, or enhance the ecosystem services. So this is possibly an active investment in natural capital, which should be recorded in triple capital accounting. Second instrument is the parametric insurance. So both payment for ecosystem services and parametric insurance monetize ecosystem values and create incentives for conservation and sustainable management of natural capital. So they rely on measurable environmental triggers or outcomes to justify the payments. But what we see is that PES create more of a baseline of positive ecosystem management, incentivize sustained protection and enhancement of natural assets, reducing ecosystem vulnerability in the long run, when parametric insurance provides more financial safety net for acute shocks or disaster, enabling rapid recovery of ecosystem after damage and minimizing long-term damage. So in the end, together we form a holistic financial toolkit. Payment for ecosystem services would foster more resilience and continuous ecosystem services, while parametric insurance addresses more episodic risk, strengthening these services. Of course, PES can learn also from advanced technologies that are used currently in parametric insurance monitoring for verification process, allowing for more precise, scalable ecosystem service management.